everybody, this is Joe Joseph, and this is the DailySheeple.com's Daily News Brief, Part 4 in a continuing series, A Brief History of the New World Order. And our journey today takes us to the early 20th century, and this is where it gets really interesting, folks, and it's something that a lot of people don't understand. You often hear politicians tout the United States as being bastions, a bastion of freedom and democracy. But very few people understand that the United States is not free. And it's not a democracy. It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be a constitutional republic. A lot of people get wrapped around the axle over the word democracy. But that's really not what we were supposed to be. Majority rule is not what's supposed to happen. The rights of minorities, the rights of the minority must be respected, and that's why we set things up that way. It's not a perfect system, but it's certainly better than a democracy. So our journey takes us to 1919, and this, my friends, is where we really run into some of the meat and potatoes of voices in history that tell it like it is. And our first stop is 1916. Now, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson's the president. 3 years prior to this, he had, I don't want to say by stealth, but certainly in a shiesty kind of way, had the Federal Reserve Act passed on like the day before Christmas when half the Congress is visiting home. You got to remember, during that time, there are no airplanes. The fastest mode of travel is train. And even then, they didn't travel at speeds that they do today. So when Congress went on recess, they went on recess, and there was no coming back. There's not like, okay, we're emergency calling Congress back into session. It would take a week, 2 weeks sometimes to get everybody back. Heck, just to communicate. You got to remember, the phone was not in every household. The telegraph was still, one of the main modes of of communication. So, just things to think about as we go through this journey. But 1916, now 3 years after signing the Federal Reserve Act into law, President Woodrow Wilson observed this. This is a direct quote from him. He said, quote, "I'm a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." Not long after this, President Wilson suffered a massive stroke that left him all but incapacitated. And his wife, Edith Galt, actually ran the office of the president for the last 2 years or so of his term. But it was because of that depression, I'm convinced, and because of what he did, the guilt, I believe, that led to the downfall of his health. It certainly contributed to it. Anybody that's been under a good amount of stress, feeling that depression, you know what kind of damage that does to your system. You know how it makes you feel. I mean, this guy, think about this. This guy, it was a double whammy, because not only did he usher in the Federal Reserve, but he also ushered in the income tax. It was a double whammy, and he knew it, but there's a price to be paid for sitting in that office. I don't care who you are, you pay a price. And President Wilson paid a very high price for sitting in the Oval Office. Now, 1917, this is something that a lot of people don't understand. See, Vladimir Lenin understood the power structure. He understood what the real push behind communism actually was. And he didn't mind being a henchman. He didn't mind being a minion. And a lot of people, Lenin was a minion? Absolutely, he was a minion. Much like George Soros propels movements by funding it with vast amounts of money and getting people to protest and getting people to rise up by paying them, by encouraging it, because it wouldn't have happened without that encouragement. You know, Black Lives Matter would have fizzled, may not have even started if it wasn't for Soros groups. All of these uprisings are rooted in money. And if you follow the money, oftentimes you'll find it goes to, one of these oligarchs or, one of the powers that shouldn't be, that just have a hair up their tuchus to make some change. But 1917, with the aid from financiers in New York City and London, Vladimir Lenin is able to overthrow the government of Russia. Lenin later comments on the apparent contradiction of the links between prominent capitalists and communism. Quote, "There also exists another alliance. At first glance, a strange one, a surprising one. But if you think about it, in fact, one which is well-grounded and easy to understand. And this, my friends, is the alliance between our communist leaders and your capitalists." Hegelian dialectic. Problem, reaction, solution. So as we're going through this timeline, you can see how the creation of communism really isn't, that's just a label they put on it. You see how it's morphed. You got Weishaupt, comes out with the 7 goals of the Illuminati. Fast forward, you have Karl Marx, who buys into Weishaupt's philosophies and the Illuminati objectives and pens the Communist Manifesto, which is basically nothing more than the New World Order / Illuminati objectives with a different name. And he embellishes a little bit and adds a couple more to and calls them his 10 planks, right? Then you have the relabeling of communism to socialism, and you have socialist groups that have sprung up in the Western world, because in the West, communism left a bad taste in people's mouths, so they didn't like that, so we called it socialism. But socialism and communism are two very similar things. And over, in Russia and Cuba, they kept that label because they had control. Now, on May 30th, 1919, prominent British and American personalities established the Royal Institute of International Affairs in England and the Institute of International Affairs in the U.S. at a meeting arranged by Colonel Edward Mandell House, attended by various Fabian socialists, including noted economist John Maynard Keynes. Now, Keynesian guys, they like the socialist blueprint. Now, the Institute of International Affairs is the precursor to the Council on Foreign Relations. And if you take a look at the Council on Foreign Relations, if you go to the CFR website, you'll notice there's a lot of prominent people that belong to the CFR. Take a look at what their stated goals are, and also take a look at the amount of media that belongs to the CFR. And if you remember, I talk about this all the time. When you do or partake or engage in journalism and you become part of the Fourth Estate, what happens? You have to abide by certain principles if you're going to do it right. One is always follow the truth, because the truth is a story. But number 2 is never enter into any entangling alliances that would prevent you from following rule number 1. And if you take a look at the roster of members of the Council on Foreign Relations, one would have to ask, how could you conscientiously join an organization like this and then claim to be impartial? You just can't do it. Well, in 1919, that's when it all kicked off with the CFR, the prelude, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Now, here's an interesting quote that I found. I was kind of floored that Winston Churchill would actually speak about this. It makes me wonder if he wasn't, let's just say, motivated to do the bidding of the powers that shouldn't be. And that perhaps earlier in life, he was a little more motivated to speak the truth. But in this case, this is about as true as you can get from one of the most famous people in 20th century history. And this occurred in 1920. Winston Churchill recognizes the connection between the Illuminati and the Bolshevik Russian Revolution. And this is what he observed. Listen to this quote. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx to those of Trotsky, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played a definite recognizable role in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It's been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century, and now at last this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and have become practically the undisputed master of this enormous empire. Just let that sink in for a moment. And there's a couple of parts of this quote that I find extremely relevant. The first one being conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization, one world order, and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, the haves and the have-nots, the dumbing down of society. You know, keep the peasantry peasants and keep the rich, make sure those bloodlines are separated. This is the way they operate, folks. Also, impossible equality. Do you notice how he says that? And the reason is because it's absolutely true. You can't force equality. You can try, but it's not going to work. And it's all a perception thing, you know? It's all designed to control under the guise of, yes, we're trying to make everybody equal. No, you're not. You're bringing people down that would normally excel, you know? And you're trying to raise people up that just may not want to be there, may not be natural. But the intended effect is a society that is dumbed down and controllable. And that's what we have here. And of course, you know, these banksters in New York and London, they financed the Russian Revolution. And they profited handsomely from it. So, anytime I see a revolution take place, because of history, I always question, where does it come from? Where is its roots? Is it authentic? And that's why I'm so against revolution. Because revolution is basically starting over and doing everything again, going full circle. The solution is not full circle here. The solution is stepping outside of that cycle, that circle, and doing something different, something radical, revolutionary. And in this case, you want to do away with inequality? Start with doing away with money, the monetary system, you know? Oh, how would you buy and sell? We'll figure it out. There's got to be a way, but money cannot be the driver. Because I think we've seen now enough throughout history that money, you know, greed and power has just destroyed this world. So you want to do something, you know, about inequality? Let's start there. Now, this is another amazing thing, and you can find all of this in the congressional record. But Louis T. McFadden was one of the few, almost like the Ron Paul of his day. McFadden and Lindbergh Sr. were two of the most underrated congressmen, I think, in the history of the United States, because of what they've done and how outspoken they were. McFadden, they say, was murdered. You know, would it surprise you? You know, same with Carol Reese, who looked into the endowments in the 1950s, you know, and then a couple years later, he's dead. And a lot of people thought, there may be some hanky-panky there. But anyway, from 1920 to 1931, Louis T. McFadden is the chair of the House Committee on Banking and Currency. Now, he was a very outspoken opponent of the Federal Reserve. Fought it it was horrible. And he knew it was a bad deal. But listen to this. This is how bad he thought it was. And how right was he? Quote, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, The people of these United States didn't perceive that a world banking system was being set up here. A super state controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. Every effort has been made by the Fed to conceal its powers, but the truth is, the Fed has usurped the government. It controls everything here, and it controls all our foreign relations. It makes or breaks governments at will. And concerning the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal, this is what he said. It was no accident. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so they might emerge as the rulers of us all. Look at history. See, now we have the luxury, and I hate to call it luxury, but that's what it is, of looking back and seeing, wow, was Louis T. McFadden, was he right? And if you take this quote and you look at history, since he made that quote, he was spot on. Absolutely spot on. What he was talking about was globalism in its infancy. And it took a long time for them to be able to get that system that they wanted. And they're not done yet, but they're very patient. You know, these corporatists, industrialists, bankers, they're the ones that are pushing for this global blueprint, for global control. Also in 1921, Colonel Edward Mandell House reorganizes the American branch of the Institute of International Affairs, again, remember, and it becomes the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, for the past 75 years, this is an amazing fact. Listen to this. For the past 75 years, 80% of the top positions in every administration, whether Democrat or Republican, have been occupied by members of this organization. Listen to that. Just let that sink in for a minute. Also, an overwhelming amount of print television media personalities are members of the CFR. You can go look at their roster, their membership. It's unbelievable the amount of media that belongs to the Council on Foreign Relations. And why? If you are a think tank on foreign policy, what do you have the press there for? What are they doing? You know, where's the value added from us to have a press that gets into these organizations and then, hey, Mr. Brokaw, hey, you remember that meeting we had last week on, you know, our position on Iran and the sanctions and all that kind of stuff? Hey, why don't we do a story on that? Could you push that? We need some propaganda to promote that. Instantly, you're compromised. You know, so I'm not really a big fan of media that get entangled in all these different alliances. It's a horrible, horrible thing. Finally, we'll stop here. December 15th, 1922, the CFR endorses world government. In its magazine Foreign Affairs, author Philip Kerr states this. Listen to this. Obviously, there's going to be no peace nor prosperity for mankind as long as the earth remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. Until some kind of international system is created, the real problem today is that of world government. So we've gone from the late 18th century to the early 20th century, and already you can see this picture that's starting to emerge. This blueprint you can see. And we're using various voices across a wide swath of history to show you just how in line all of these different organizations are with one another. The stated goal, of course, ultimately being control. That's what they want. And that's what they're going to get. They want to control you. And they are going to control you. Unless we stop it. And the only way to stop it, folks, is not to participate, not to consent, and to have real change. I don't know if what we're going to see in the White House or what people in the UK are going to see with Brexit. It was certainly positive to see people rise up and let their voices be heard, but they let their voices be heard in systems that are broken. And so the idea is to not participate in systems that are broken. And instead, remove yourself from that system and make change, real change, for the better. Because I got to tell you, Our children aren't going to have a nice world to live in if we continue down this road. I'm Joe Joseph. This was the DailySheeple.com's Daily News Brief, Part 5 tomorrow in the continuing series of brief history of the New World Order. Have a great day, everybody.